Okay, so good morning, everyone. Today is the last session of this semester's gathering, and today we have Mike Mensink talking about the effects of seductive details on emotions and recall for scientific misconceptions.
Well, let me know if any questions pop up on Zoom because I've got it hidden on my computer. So
Yep, I'll be looking at it.
yeah,
Yep.
very good. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about seductive details and scientific misconceptions today. And actually, the last time I presented my research in not a workshop as was 2019 of July. Otherwise, I've been doing online conferences since then. So a little bit about me. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin Stout. I'm also the IRB chair. And for those of you who are members of Society for Text and Discourse, I was the secretary and conference, one of the conference organizers from about 2017 to 2022. I actually got my PhD from the University of Minnesota, and I'm still an affiliate cognitive science faculty member for whatever that that means. But I was a text group member and coordinator from about 2006 to 2011, and educational psychology graduate student. So it's been a while though since I've been here at the University of Minnesota. My research interests and the current project, I've got other research interests and other stuff that I do, but currently looking at cognitive and emotional responses to irrelevant and incorrect scientific information. And this kind of comes in two flavors in my research, which involves scientific misconceptions and seductive details, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later in the presentation. But Kate Bone-Gettler and Johanna Kakkonen, we have a book coming out this July that's based on the special issue that came out in DP a couple of years ago called Emotions in Reading, Learning, and Communication, but did a project that I'll talk a little bit about with seductive details. And then I've got a current project that's currently back for revise and resubmit with the RAP Lab at Northwestern University with Mandy Withall, graduate student there, on confidence and knowledge calibrations. Not necessarily looking at misconceptions, but thinking about how readers might be confident or overconfident about their knowledge of scientific topics. So those two things are kind of hopefully going to come together for this current project. So a lot of my research has looked at interest in learning, and what we know from the psychology literature and the educational psychology literature on interest is that generally when readers are more interested in the content that they're reading, we generally see better outcomes as far as like learning, persistence, motivation. We generally like it when students are interested and readers are interested in content. The unfortunate thing about interest, it's a little bit tricky. Is that a lot of textbook authors and science authors add irrelevant information that's sort of off topic, but kind of tangentially related to things, to like textbooks to increase student interest. So I've got some examples here in a minute, but the irrelevant additions tend to be focused on what Kinch called emotionally interesting content. So things that have to do with the human condition. That includes things like death, drug use, money, fame, violence, and sex. Or they might be cognitively interesting things. And again, Kinch sort of posited these things in a paper in the 80s on novel trivia, factoids, cartoons and pictures. Humor might be somewhere in between these two things, but they're both kind of broadly defined as seductive details in the text and discourse literature. So this is an example that I pulled from one of our psychology textbooks. This is actually taken from the psychology textbook that we use at UW Stout. So this, I'm even forgetting, this sort of shows the impact of seductive details. I always forget what this is actually focused on as far as a social psychology topic. But this little vignette about Dirk Williams, who actually stopped and helped. He was a persecuted religious minority. He fell through the ice in Holland. He stopped and helped his pursuer out of the ice, and his pursuer still threw him in jail, and he was killed a while later. He was executed because of his religious minority. I think this is on like positive affect or like helping behaviors. I can't quite remember from our textbook, but you can see they allocate a lot of time to it from the Myers and DeWall textbook. This is another one. Also comes from a social psychology chapter in an intro textbook. I've tried to find a better picture of this, but I'm unable to track down the specific textbook edition. But this, believe it or not, has to do with medial prefrontal cortex and how that's activated when you're thinking about people. I guess maybe like a theory of mind or those type of things. But they threw in a picture of Justin Bieber here and said when Justin Bieber thinks about you, it activates his prefrontal cortex, and when you think about him, it activates your prefrontal cortex. So that's kind of a fun, I don't know if that helps students or what, but it's in there. So yeah. When we add these things to texts, readers allocate more attention to that seductive content as opposed to other scientific content that they might be are supposed to be reading. So if we're looking at gaze duration or sentence reading times, that's what we see. The recall for main ideas and exam performance is actually lower for scientific content when they're added compared to when those seductive details are taken out. Readers have better recall for that seductive content compared to other content when the seductive details are not present. And then when we ask readers what's interesting in what you just read, they're much more likely to rate those seductive details as more interesting than the scientific information they were supposed to be learning. So seductive detail effects kind of cover a broad scope of cognitive and emotional responses for readers when they're present in text. So in thinking about refutation effects and how interest might play a role in that, then we do know that when readers are interested in a text, but they have low science knowledge, they're more likely to engage in conceptual change. So there has been some research that's been done with like basic or general text interest and if a reader is likely to engage in refutation or not, or updating a misconception that they have. There's some kind of interesting or weird outcomes that happen when readers are really interested in stuff. If that predicts conceptual change or not, it seems to be like an indirect prediction if they're highly interested in what they're reading. But we do know that higher text interest increases rereading in refutation text. So if we give a reader a text that they're interested in, they're more likely to reread that text compared to a text they're not interested in. But it's got these weird mixed effects on post-test. So whether that has an effect on like updating or learning after a refutation, it's kind of unclear currently. And a part of interest, so emotional response, like positive affect, interest is part of that, but there's other emotional responses that might occur. Generally, for text researchers, we consider curiosity and interest to be positive emotions. So when readers demonstrate those for text, we consider that to be part of like a positive affect sort of package that we might see from readers. For non-seductive texts, and this is true for refutation texts, but also for other kinds of scientific texts in most circumstances, when readers have a negative emotion to refutation text, we tend to see more updating or increased refutation effects. So, those negative emotions might be like, not frustration, but embarrassment that they were wrong or had incorrect knowledge or those type of things. For seductive detail text, and this is based on my own work, we also see that negative emotions predict better recall of scientific content. So that lines up with other work that's been done on emotions. But when readers have a positive emotional response to seductive details, scientific content recall then is reduced. So if they read these seductive details, they're like, wow, that's awesome. That does tend to predict worse performance than in remembering or learning from scientific content. So about what you would expect. So this is kind of the crux of this project and why I started on this project as kind of like the next phase of my research line after COVID-19. So what I started to realize is like no studies to date have actually looked at seductive details and their effect on refutation effects. There's one that used seductive pictures done in 2023. So they added 2 seductive pictures or very interesting pictures. They actually didn't do the full norming process, which is kind of needed to figure out if something's a seductive detail or just a really interesting picture. But they actually found when they added these 2 seductive pictures to a text on genetically modified foods, I think they said one of the pictures was a banana stuffed with sausage, which is kind of interesting, I guess. Readers that got the refutation text then had higher post-test scores, 6.7, and then when they added those 2 seductive detail pictures, then the post-test scores were reduced. And they kind of attributed this to extraneous cognitive load. So readers were spending time looking at that banana sausage as opposed to sort of focusing on the refutation stuff that they're supposed to learn. So, but this is it. This is the only article that I was able to find on seductive details, and they, Jin and also mentioned in their own literature search that they were unable to find any other research that's been done with seductive details on refutation. So it's an area that's ripe for kind of looking at this stuff. Yep.
Sorry, I just have a question about the general setup for refutation text studies. Is the idea that the participants have some misconception and then the text, so like everybody who's doing the study has some misconception?
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I wasn't quite sure whether to include the rundown on misconception and refutation. So the traditional refutation text experimental paradigm is that you bring your participants in, you give them a post-test or pre-test on their knowledge about a scientific concept, and you look for those readers that have answered sort of items on a misconception incorrectly, and those are like your misconception readers, and then you look for updating then on a post-test when they've gone through and read this text. There's a bunch of different ways to do refutations. The most common one that's seen a lot is that the text gradually builds to a point where readers are sort of informed. A lot of people think X, but that's not true. Is one of the ways that's done. There's others. There's a bunch of others to sort of refute, but that's sort of the idea. You activate the incorrect knowledge, and then you explicitly refute it.
Okay.
To readers, and I'll hopefully you'll get a sense of that when I start going through my own text. So, like I said, the genetically modified foods one I think had to do with like how they're created and what effects they might have on the human body and those type of things. So, and I'll talk about this for the project. The refutation literature right now, a lot of researchers are spending time on stuff like vaccine beliefs. Climate change is another big one. We kind of, a lot of refutation researchers have picked high, like topics that readers have a high emotional investment in. And for this topic, I wanted to avoid that for this project. So I'll kind of give you a sense of what I use for the text for this project. So the general questions then are, how might seductive detail text then influence the refutation effect as a general question? And I'm specifically interested in how readers emotionally respond to refutation texts when seductive details are present, and also their cognitive response. So if they're updating misconceptions, what their memory might look like, if they're learning or not, but also like how they're kind of thinking about their emotional response to these texts. And again, I'm purposely picking a topic that I hope your average reader doesn't have like a strong emotional response to, because I want to see how the text is pushing that around as opposed to a topic that readers might bring emotions with them, as far as like vaccines or those type of things. Specific questions that this project is looking at is what happens when seductive details are embedded in the scientific content. That's the typical format for seductive detail text, is that we kind of embed them across the document. But I'm also planning on a version where the refutation paragraph or the refutation content is basically loaded with seductive details, because we can focus seductive details on death. And when you're talking about, a health misconception, you can say, well, people that haven't done this have died, basically. So that's ways we can do that. So, okay. So the project overview, where I'm at currently, experiments 1 and 2 have been run with undergraduates, and we'll look at some data today. Experiment 3 is planned. I'm going to be running it in Prolific, hopefully with a pool of about 125 participants, but Prolific's kind of spendy, so we'll see what we get. But like I said, the standard refutation setup is pre-test, read the text, have refutations present or not, do some post stuff, and then do a post test to see if there's been updating or those type of things. And then experiment 4 is kind of is far in the future probably, but the first 2 experiments were simply norming to get the text working the way I kind of wanted to do it. So the first experiment, we're doing ratings, sentence ratings, and emotional response to the text. And then the second experiment then was actually measuring memory, or measuring free recall from participants that got that seductive details text. Okay, so here's the misconception that I decided to go with. It's one of interest to college students. They generally sometimes think about their liver and what their liver is doing. Some general misconceptions that are present that we see, and this is taken from a variety of hospitals and medical organizations, Mayo Clinic, is that liver detoxes or cleanses can take toxins out of the body, that liver detoxes or cleanses can improve general health, that liver detoxes or cleanses can help people lose weight, and that detox programs or liver supplements will fix liver damage. So those are just some of the misconceptions that are present about this. Okay, and these are specifically focused on these programs. Having a good diet and getting exercise will help people lose weight, but taking these liver supplements and those type of things will not. So this is just an example when you do a Google search for books that are on liver health and detoxing. So you can't tell me that, you know, as far as like an applied aspect of this project, that these misconceptions are not present in the natural, in you know, outside the lab. They are, right? Like this is, it goes on and on. Okay, people really want to help their livers. I mean, why not? Okay, so this is just, if you do a quick search of like liver, you know, how can I detox my liver? These are just some of the things that pop up just with the general internet search. And this one's my favorite if you're into coffee. So coffee enemas, for whatever reason, are very popular in the liver detoxing belief system. So, you know, if you're into that, doing coffee enemas, you know, I guess that's one of the 6 steps to cleanse your liver. So going in that direction instead of drinking the coffee. I don't know why. We don't we don't address that one specifically in our text, but it might come up. I don't know. We'll see. So my undergrad research assistants helped me adapt the text. Some very small sections were AI generated, a couple sentences to help us like start with the framework, but we pulled a lot of it from hospital documents that hospitals put together and those type of things. And then the seductive details that we added were taken from various things that I could find on like irrelevant liver stuff and stories. And I'll show you some examples. So the actual science content is kind of broken into 2 areas. And there's going to be some more analysis that I'm going to do on the specific sentences that are embedded, but most of it has to do with the function and biological processes of the liver, how the liver actually functions. And then there's a few sections that talk about detox diets and juice cleanses, just introducing students to the idea that people do these things to improve health and flush out their liver and those kind of things. And then seductive details, there's 11 sentences that we consider to be seductive details that were written as part of this project. So 6 were kind of framed around emotional interest. So again, death, mostly, or bodily functions, that the bad things that happen when you engage in these detox diets and juice cleanses. And then there's a couple based on cognitive interests that again are just kind of like factoids or interesting trivia that's not really relevant to liver function. So here's some examples. So for cognitive interest, and these were highly interesting to my college students, of course, my participants who were college students. So some functions of the liver include, you know, metabolizing ingested drugs like THC edibles or alcoholic beverages like beer and wine. And then the second one, so Ayurveda, I'm probably saying it incorrectly, in ancient Indian practice and traditional Chinese medicine both use fasting to encourage liver health. So, and fasting is a part of many modern religions. So it's kind of like novel trivia. These don't work as seductive details necessarily as effectively as the emotional interest ones. So this was kind of talking about like things, people who engage in these juice diets. So that's all they consume is like raw juice and juiced vegetables and fruit. They're told to add chaste tree berries and wild yams to increase their sex drive. So there's a lot of beliefs about like things that don't increase sperm count and those type of things. And then there's a lot of news articles about different individuals who did like really extreme juice cleanses, and it really stresses the body. So there was an Australian cricket athlete, and this is, I mean, these are true, these are not made up, that who they believe had a heart attack by a really, really extreme 2-week juice cleanse in 2022. So pretty standard kind of seductive detail there embedded in the text. So, okay, so participants, I'll go through the method specifically, but you know, they were told to read the text carefully and at their own pace so that they could understand the content, and not to move on to the next section until they had completed reading the text and understood it. And then they were told they'd complete some tasks after the text, some tasks after the text after they had finished reading. And this is what it looked like in Qualtrics. So this was all set up in Qualtrics. So it was kind of, spaced out and meant to take up the whole page, and they could scroll down and scroll back up, but they couldn't return to the text after they had moved on. And that was, I mean, they were told that. So, but we'll talk about this when we get to the recalls, about things that happen. So the University of Wisconsin Stout, just to give you an idea of the population that I'm drawing a sample from, our average age skews a little bit older because we have a lot of non-traditional students, but the sample that I drew comes from our intro psych, our psychology participation pool, so it's closer to the average age of an undergraduate. But our gender balance is a little bit different because engineering is a big field. We tend to, at Stout, and just because of the way we see gender makeups for the STEM fields, unfortunately, we tend to draw a higher male student ratio to female student ratio, unlike a lot of colleges. But our ACT score is actually a little bit closer to the national average in 2023, 22.65, compared to the University of Minnesota, which I looked this up, and it's really high. From when I was a graduate student, I feel like it's gone way up, but it's 29 here at Minnesota, as opposed to the USA average is actually 19.5 for 2023. So this is just to kind of place, the stuff that we'll be looking at later. So 60 students then from Stout participated, pretty standard sample as far as Stout goes. And then the average age, you can see, was a little bit closer to the average age of your intro psych undergraduate. So, okay, so methods, they completed this project through Qualtrics on their own computer outside the lab. So, we're kind of letting things roll as far as that goes. They were given no time limit to read the text. And then they completed the epistemically-related emotion scale after reading the text, and rated each sentence for importance and interest, randomly ordered by participants. Is there a question?
Yeah, so Randy asks, was the comment about coffee enemas a seductive detail?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
Okay.
But I want all of you to not get, you got to focus on the science content, not the seductive details. So this is the epistemically-related emotion scales. It's from Pekrun and some others from 2016. And it basically measures emotions that they've kind of found readers experience when they're learning from texts. There's a short form to this that doesn't have this many emotional responses, but I tend to like to give the full the full scale. So curious, surprised, interested, inquisitive, amazed, happy, excited, astonished, and joyful, and then bored, confused, anxious, frustrated, and the rest there for negative valence. And we tend to collapse them across positive valence and negative valence just to get a sense. But I always kind of set interested aside just to see how readers responded in general to the text. So participants went through, they read the text, they completed that epistemic emotion scale, and then randomly counterbalanced, they rated each sentence for interest or importance, and then did the opposite task. So this is what it looked like in Qualtrics. So importance and interest. They're told up front, some sentences in a text are more important than others, some are more interesting than others. Please go through and rate these. So it's kind of a sentence by sentence. It's a unique setup. I mean, we typically don't ask readers to do this kind of sentence by sentence and rate these things, but it does sort of help us understand at the sentence level how they're experiencing these things. So as far as hypotheses go, generally, I thought participants would rate the seductive text as more positively than negatively, which is based on my own research experiences. Participants tend to like seductive detailed texts a little bit more than they dislike them. That seductive details would be rated as more interesting than scientific content, and that scientific content would be rated as more important than seductive details. So that was the hypothesis. So as far as emotional responses to the text, students, generally when we give them science texts in these experiments, we tend to not see very high positivity ratings. This is on a 5-point scale, the emotional response scale is. So we're under the midpoint, right, of kind of 3. So participants aren't super happy about it, but they aren't experiencing a lot of negative affect either. So more positive than negative, but again, you can see we're underneath 2.5. So we're, most students are kind of meh about it, but more positive than negative. So, okay, so let's look at importance first as far as those sentence ratings go. So this, and I'll talk about this, this was unexpected My participants really thought the seductive details were pretty important in the text compared to the science content, because a lot of the seductive details are focused on, like, this is what happens when you do these, do X, Y, and Z, and yeah. So this didn't hold up to my hypotheses. I mean, it's trending in the right way, but that's not a significant difference as far as science content versus the seductive details. But we are getting the interest levels compared to the scientific content that was expected for the seductive details, and the interaction is there. So the interaction is present as far as, type of sentence versus rating. So things are trending in that way, but they, because I think everything's kind of focused on liver health, students were just kind of going through and saying, like, yeah, this seems really important to know, like, how my liver is helping me process THC gummies. So, something for me to keep in mind as I go through as I go through this. So as far as this goes, that text was, the seductive details text was more positively than negatively rated during reading. The seductive details were rated as more interesting than scientific content. Scientific content was rated as more important than interesting, but seductive details were also rated as high in importance. So I'm getting like the partial interaction, but not the full crossover that I kind of want for this. So it's probably there. The true test is always with the memory effects, which is the next experiment 2 here as far as that goes. So looking at free recall. So experiment 2 had 61 undergraduate students, again, from the psychology participant pool. Again, fairly close to what the first sample was, slightly older, but that's not a significant difference. So same thing, very same setup, Qualtrics link on their own computer, read the text with no time limit, completed the epistemic emotion scale after reading, but based on their reading, and then were instructed to complete a free recall, and they couldn't go back to the text to complete the free recall. Okay. So for experiment 2, the hypotheses, same thing, thought they'd rate the seductive detail text more positively than negatively after reading. That in their free recalls, that they would recall a higher proportion of seductive details as compared to scientific content. And that as far as, so this is always the third part, and I did this in my 2022 paper, try and predict their recall of content based on their emotional responses while reading. That negative reading emotions would predict recall of scientific content, and that positive reading emotions would predict recall of seductive details. Okay, so here's the recall instructions, and this is something when we in Text and Discourse submit papers for review and we do a free recall, a lot of times the reviewers want to see what the specific instructions were that were given to participants for recall, because you can do like different instructions where you kind of ask people to specifically focus on something while they're doing a recall. But for this, we just wanted people to try and remember as much as they can. I mean, you could give them instructions to like write down the most interesting things you remember from the text, or write down, how a liver functions. You could direct their recall in different ways with instructions. But for this, it's just like, give me as much as you can remember. Okay. For text and discourse stuff, we tend to take sentences and break them into discrete idea units, because sometimes a sentence can have more than one idea. And what we're interested in is like, if a participant only recalls part of a sentence, but it's a full idea, we want to give them credit for that, right, when we're doing these. So the text was actually broken into 64 idea units, 43 scientific content idea units, and then 18 seductive detail idea units. And I had 2 research assistants that didn't know about the hypothesis for this project helping with that. And then I coded some recalls as well. So I didn't have time in doing this project to calculate reliability, but generally we had a general agreement about like what things were where and those type of things. Okay, so just in this room, how have folks collected free recalls from human participants before and gotten this kind of memory dump from undergrads?
Yes, but I haven't analyzed it.
I talk about this in my research methods class, and I put up this picture from Cursed AI because it makes me laugh. So we were having a discussion on the text group listserv a little bit about reading issues that students might be demonstrating when they're coming to college. Some of them are, and some of them aren't. Okay, so I collected. There were 61 free recalls. I had to throw some of them out for various obvious reasons. 10 were what I call encoding/retrieval failures that were acknowledged on the part of the participants. So I had 4 that were just blank. They just ended the survey. I forgot pretty much everything. I went through it quickly and didn't retain much. My favorite, they were doing it while they were watching the Super Bowl. I didn't see the article, to be honest, and it won't let me return. I took a break from the survey and don't remember anything. I have bad ADHD and just answered the emotion piece and have forgotten everything. So I appreciate the honesty. It's like, you know, I can't use this, right? So 10 participants just did not. We would, if in a publication, this would be like, you know, participants failed to follow the experimental instructions is kind of what we tend to talk about. So that was 10. 6 were what I call meta recalls, which were like, I'm going to summarize everything I did into one sentence. It was very boring. They explain what the liver does. The liver processes the things you eat. Liver functions can be affected by a lot of things. The article talked about how the liver functions. And my favorite, that feels like it was written by an AI agent. So it was really interesting to read. It was mainly more than what I expected coming from the passage, but it was still catching my attention. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. So my final sample is 45 out of the 61 that took the recall survey. And this is, I mean, this is standard. I saw this when I was doing my dissertation. The numbers are maybe a little bit higher, and you get better fidelity when you run participants in the lab. But this is kind of to be expected when you let participants read things on their own laptops and do the recall outside the lab. This is like the control we give up to have that naturalistic situation. So
at least now you have balanced gender.
right? Yeah, I mean, it sometimes works out, and the age came down a little bit closer then to, you know, to kind of like our average undergraduate first year and second year. So and things thankfully worked out for the most part. I lost too much power for one of my regressions, which I'll talk about a little bit, but that's the way it goes. So for proportion recall by sentence type, so again, because there's different amounts of scientific content and seductive content in the text, there's more science content than seductive details, we go by proportion or percentage of the possible idea units that they could recall. Okay, so it's an equivalent comparison. And production of seductive details is almost twice as much, is exactly twice as much as scientific content. So readers are producing 20% of their recalls are seductive details, and then about 10%, they're getting about 10% of that scientific content as we described it. So we are seeing a seductive details effect for this, for that seductive document. When we look at emotion ratings by valence, so this is experiment 1, which I showed earlier. And for experiment 2 is basically the same. Okay, same patterns. We're replicating that kind of reading experience. I need to run the actual, it looks like experiment 2 is a little bit lower, but I think that's just, I don't think that's significant. So basically the same pattern as far as like more positive than negative for reading. Okay, so when we're trying to predict recall then of scientific content, what we do see is that as affect, and this is a little bit opposite direction of what I had for a previous research study, but that was a slightly different experimental setup. As negative affect increases, then their recall of seductive scientific content also goes down. What this probably means is as students got either more frustrated with the experiment or just really didn't like the text at all that I had provided, their recall was much worse, right? So the emotion scale is kind of odd because we measure seductive, or we measure positive emotions in a separate scale from negative emotions. So you can have low negative emotions and low positive emotions. Yeah, so as negative affect increases, they really don't recall much, which, I mean, to be expected. They didn't like the text. They're just like, eh. Negative emotions, yeah, that was negative emotions. Positive emotions didn't play a role. So if they had a higher positive response to the text, they didn't actually recall more in terms of scientific content.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Didn't the related works set the opposite finding?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
So and that was based for like refutation stuff or non-seductive text. Yeah. So I didn't because of the way this experiment was designed, I haven't run participants through with a non-seductive details text. Like everybody's getting a seductive details text. So the presence of those seductive details then I think will changes some of this negative affect aspects. Yeah. So, but yes, this is different than what I have found in previous research and different from what some of those other studies have suggested about negative affect and what that's doing to memory and learning.
And also the negative affect is kind of like two separate things, right? I mean, you can have negative emotions about the content, but also the negative emotions about the test itself. Right?
Yeah, and this was and that my 2022 study, I counterbalanced that. So they did one on the reading, and then some participants did it after the recall. The emotional responses are collected before the recall. So this is just from reading. So this is just their experience with the text.
Okay.
And yeah, and looking at that. So these are just this is like them saying, I don't care for this text, basically, after reading it.
Okay.
So, but because you can have an emotional response to the recall process too. Absolutely. Or the experiment in general. For seductive details, then, again, this is a little bit different than what I've found. So positive emotions are marginal. So it's 0.08 or 0.08. So it's on that marginal level. Like I said, I ran out of power just because of my participants and what happened with my sample. But it's close. As positive affect went up, then they were more likely to produce seductive details on a marginal level. Negative responses, same thing. As negative emotions increased, they're much more likely to not produce seductive details, probably just to have low recall overall. They didn't like the text, they're not producing much at all. Okay, so yeah. So same thing as experiment 1. Participants rated the text more positively. Participants recall a higher proportion of seductive details as compared to scientific content. So it's suggesting that this text is hopefully working as a seductive details text. And then that recall regression, I need to do a little bit more analysis. And I don't think at this point adding participants is going to help. But I'm just going to see what happens with the prolific sample. Because I did run out of power, but it's one of the practicalities of working at a regional university where you have a limited sample to begin with as far as that goes. So yeah. Okay. So I don't have too much left. Like I said, this is a project in progression. So I did want to get some feedback from folks because I still haven't completed the refutation aspect. But I think I've got a text on liver function that probably elicits the seductive details effect in readers based on those 2 studies. And then the next step is to move on to a project that's going to actually engage in that refutation process. So my prediction, based on previous research, seductive pictures reduce the refutation effect. That's what previous research has suggested. I'm thinking it's probably likely that seductive text will have the same effect. That people who get a seductive detail, readers that get a seductive details text, are probably going to demonstrate a reduced refutation effect to refutations compared to readers that don't. So, but I don't know. It is unknown how readers will respond to seductive refutation. So if I take all my seductive details and build that into a refutation paragraph, we know seductive details draw attention during reading. So that might help, that might cause readers to reread that refutation paragraph and have an increased refutation effect. That's one possibility. On the other hand, it might get them thinking about the wrong things when they're engaging in a refutation, or you might have a backfire effect if they're like, yeah, I don't buy it. So those are all examples. So experiment 3, like I said, I'm going to try and run it in a prolific, hopefully in June before ST&D, because I'm due to give a poster on this project in July. So the idea is that we're going to do a pretest and collect confidence ratings. So this is, we did this with the project that I did with the RAP lab at Northwestern. You have them take a pretest, but you also collect how confident they are in their answers about their knowledge about liver function and liver health. They'll read that seductive details text or a non-seductive details text, and it might be a 2x2 where there's a refutation version and a non-refutation version. So there'd be 4 versions of the text. I need to figure out the power though, because I might just have to go with the seductive details text, and then some people get the refutation and some people don't. They'll take that emotional response scale and then a post test with confidence ratings again to see if you've had some refutation effect and what that's done to confidence or not. And then experiment 4 is probably going to look at seductive details, if they're embedded across the text or if it's a final paragraph with all the seductive details kind of loaded into that refutation content. So there you go. Special thanks to my URAs that helped me with coding and kind of set this stuff up, Devin Close and Tasha Komperud, and I'm happy to answer any comments or answer any questions or collect any comments or insights that you might have. So.
All right, thank you very much. Very exciting. Yeah, do we have any comments or feedback? People on the Zoom? Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, Mike. That was an
Hello.
awesome presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
I have a question about refutation texts. So imagining a refutation text without seductive details, within that text, there are going to be more and less interesting / important parts, even before you add seductive details. So
Right.
my guess would be the moment the refutation arrives, aha, you thought X, but it's actually all wrong, would be a moment of heightened interest. So I'm wondering how you balance the interest and importance of the refutation text as a rhetorical structure versus the interest / importance of the seductive details that you want to insert into the refutation text.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Now you got me thinking I might have to do a third norming study on that refutation content. Yeah, it's I would agree. That's one of the reactions that readers can have, certainly for the refutation stuff. I need to go back to that first paper I talked about. I think by Sinatra and a few others where they looked at the crossover of knowledge versus interest. So because when readers had high scientific knowledge or high knowledge about the topic and high interest, they did not experience that refutation, that kind of updating, or when they reported that. It was only when they had low knowledge.
Low knowledge, sure.
And,
that makes
and high interest. Yeah.
Which, yeah, exactly. So that would suggest they would find it more interesting, therefore potentially more memorable. So it's wanting, as I was saying, just wanting to be able to distinguish memorability from what I'll call just the rhetorical structure of a refutation text. There's a kind of key big moment when the refutation arrives that's kind of the climax.
Yes.
Versus the more atomized interest of the seductive details that you get to plant. And so I think that it would be interesting to, loaded word, it would be useful to be able to distinguish the two.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, in having sort of been combing this research area this past semester, there is not a ton on interest and reputations and conceptual change. The research area is starting to go that way with sort of the emotion folks, Greg Trevors and a couple others that are looking at these warm and cold factors that are involved in updating. But they've definitely talked about how this is an unmined area for this, because we've kind of been focusing on the cognitive stuff, like how do we structure these texts and just get them to work. The reader affects and responses have kind of been trailing behind. So yeah, thanks for that.
Cool. Varun comments that he's also running some analysis on multiple document study about vaccines that measured participants' emotional valence plus arousal throughout reading. And yeah, this is really informative and interesting.
Yeah, that's I know Trevor's and a couple other people have been looking at that. I'm always, so like I said, there was a bunch of us that sort of did an emotions what's the word for it, an emotion session at STND back in 2019, and so it's starting to come along. I just like I said, I'm concerned about that topic because we bring in readers that already have really established emotional responses, especially after COVID. So it's that text in particular, I think you get a different response now if you run. I'm not sure when that data set was collected. I'm not saying it's not going to be some interesting stuff, and there's a big gap in this area that needs to be filled for sure. So yeah, look forward to seeing what we find with that.
Yes, this is just maybe to optimize as you're looking at your participants coming in. It just struck me that the somewhat older participants just opted out, and so I mean you might be able to just optimize from the beginning how many valid outcomes you get by saying just cutting it off at a certain age, because maybe this particular topic is just like as you get busier, and I was like, okay, I don't have time to worry about my liver or something. I mean, it's interesting what interests people that might be just age related, and maybe you could just optimize.
Yeah. So I mean, so again, these are participants from our participation pool, and senior level students that are taking intro to psych are a different student, right, than first years.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
So whether it's systematic or not, I couldn't tell you, but yeah, I mean that's
which is related.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So
for sure.
I'm just thinking it's like I don't.
There's ways to set it up and Prolific does this when you sort of run with these online participation pools where you have attention checks, and if they don't produce data that the researcher is that sort of meets the criteria, then they might not get paid. But we can't set that up with intro pools. You kind of have to let participants
just let it roll forward.
Yeah, I mean that's just the way they have to work. But that was why, and that was a conscious decision for the third experiment. I'm like, I want good data. Not that my undergrad population is bad. It's just I want to run this with a larger group that's maybe willing to do all the things I want them to do.
Exactly.